Hey everybody, it's me, Green Beauty ASMR. We are going to read this article today. This is an article related to individuation and abuse. So please be warned that some of this might be triggering for you, as we will be talking about trauma and abuse. This is an article that comes out of a professional magazine that I subscribe to as a psychotherapist. So this is not readily available, but I thought I would read it for you. And let's see what comes up. I know a lot of you like to listen to stuff related to this field, so let's read it and see what happens. And I appreciate you being here with me. Individuation and Abuse, an Improbable Pairing. Sean Cook. He has his Master's of Arts. He's an Associate Marriage and Family Therapist, which means he's not licensed yet. And he is part of the American Professional Clinical Counselor Association as well. Okay, let's begin. Individuation. According to founding analyst Carl Gustav Jung, so Carl Jung, we've all heard of him, he's a genius. Individuation is a process of differentiation, having for its goal the development of the individual personality. So individuation is something we all go through when we are developing through adolescence and young adulthood. And sometimes we can get stuck in individuating from our family if we're very enmeshed and dysfunctional, but I don't want to take up too much time, so we won't go into that. Okay. And the goal of the individuation process is the synthesis of the self. Rather than closely examine the arduous and rather succinct nature and course of Jung's definition of individuation, this article will assess it in terms of psycho-spiritual development. The process of becoming more integrated, whole, and complete in all aspects of oneself. It will then explore the degenerative neurobiological effects of early childhood trauma and the impact that may have on an individual's ability to be and express who they are physically, emotionally, psychologically, and spiritually. In short, this piece will explore how trauma, particularly when inflicted by parents through neglect or abuse, systematically induces its victims to become characterological shadow constructs of their unresolved parental images and constrains them in their capacity and ability to express their precious, unique internal aspects and qualities of soul. Okay? So this is basically saying that biologically, children's brains change when they are in an abusive situation or a neglectful situation. Neglect is a form of abuse. And through this change of their neurobiological aspect, all these areas of themselves are impaired. Since modern man knows himself only insofar as he can become conscious of himself, a capacity largely dependent on environmental conditions, it is suitable to say that the individuation process involves the capacity, culmination, and control of consciousness in an effort to integrate both conscious and unconscious activities in service to the entirety of the individual in relation to others. In its simplest formula, individuation is the capacity for wholeness and evolved consciousness. So that's what we want to think about. When we grow up and maybe we move out of the house or maybe we don't, it differs from culture to culture. We want to be able to begin our own personal journey to wholeness and evolved consciousness. And it's our hope that we come from a family that has provided a safe foundation where we feel we can individuate and begin this process. It is also a lifelong development of personality and specifically refers to the process of becoming the personality that one innately is, potentially from the beginning of life. So individuation is also when we really begin to learn about ourselves and really shape our personality. Fundamentally, then, the individuation process is a natural and universal dynamic occurring in every form of life that is consciously and actively shaped by the personality organization and internal drive mechanisms of each individual. Its goal is the consciousness recognition, development, and expression of the latent potentialities inherent in each organism. From a religious or spiritual point of view, individuation involves an active, ongoing relation between the individual and the transcendent that results in a communion with the transpersonal. So just a side note for those of you listening, there's a whole field in psychology called transpersonal psychology, okay? So this is an idea and a perspective that when we sit with you in client and therapist, we view you not just as your mind and your emotions, but you are body, mind, and spirit. So we recognize that you have a soul. We recognize that many individuals are on journeys of spiritual recognition, something like that, and maybe not. Even if you're not, this really just takes into mind another aspect outside of just the brain. This internal union then acts as a form of navigation and negotiation that furthers the humane and ethical development of the individual. With this in mind, this article will endeavor to convey what happens to the collective capacity of the human psyche to process conscious and unconscious material in an effort to assimilate and integrate information essential to the individuation process when trauma strikes through neglect and abuse. So this article is going to tell us how somebody individuates from a transpersonal perspective when they have encountered trauma and abuse. Okay. The word trauma is derived from the Greek word for wound, hurt, or defeat, concepts that may be correlated with different aspects of human experience. A wound is physiological, hurt is psychological and emotional, and defeat is spiritual. So that's an interesting construct he's laying out here. All of these aspects deeply taint and adversely affect one's self-construct. It is the contention of this article that all unmitigated forms of childhood neglect and abuse result in traumatic induction. I completely agree with that. The fragility and vulnerability of the infant organism in its unprotected state is too open and receptive to environmental circumstances to warrant any other possibility. This is very true. I will tell you, infants, let's say 0 to 2 or 3, even though there is not a conscious memory of specific abuse, you will find things beginning to surface over time that correlate with an infant who's been neglected or abused, even though they don't remember consciously. This includes, of course, parentally inflicted abuse or neglect resulting in trauma and its consequent effects on a child's capacity to accurately conceptualize a coherent sense of self. Okay? Trauma is internalized as part of the self-construct of the individual. This is very, very, very important. In self-psychology, a self-object is essentially an internalized or introjected relationship with an external object or person. using this psychological construct of an introjected external model to understand the probable outcome of any experience with a primary caregiver, the ministration of a parent or caretaker will evoke in a child a self-object experience that leads to the age-appropriate structuring into an organization that we call the self. Okay, so that means a child identifies their parent or caretaker as the self-object. So we need that in order to form the self. Okay, this means that the child learns to internalize and eventually model the dynamics of interactions with primary caretakers. They become imprinted and embedded within the workings of the psyche. On the other hand, a child who has been neglected, abused, or otherwise bereft of constructive, self-reflective, and self-actualizing experiences in childhood, particularly during key developmental phases, will not only grow deficient in these areas, but will also very likely become depressed, bitter, angry, resentful, and vindictive as a result. How many of you know somebody like that? Or maybe you yourself struggle a little bit with that. The intrinsically insular and social networks in the psyche necessary for understanding and integration, and therefore individuation, are impaired through the effects of trauma. One of the foremost experts in the field of trauma and its neurobiological effects on children is Dutch psychiatrist Bessel van der Kolk, who noted that most trauma begins at home. This is very true, and that the vast majority of people, about 80%, responsible for child maltreatment are children's own parents. It is now a known fact that chronic trauma as a result of neglect or abuse not only interferes with the neurobiological development, it also impairs socialization and communication by interfering with developmental processes in the evolving brain of the infant. This is so true. I have seen it over and over and over again with the children I have worked with in the past. When primary caregivers are negligent, physically or emotionally absent or inconsistent, the inconsistency is a big one, manipulative or controlling or violent, children respond by becoming frustrated and distressed that their environment can offer little or no relief in response. As a result, children develop a sense of abject helplessness and despair, as they are unable to establish a sense of stability or control that results in a sense of safety and autonomy. They instead experience intense states of anger or anxiety, conflated with normal attachment longings to be cared and provided for, sometimes so extreme as to precipitate states of disassociation and aggression towards oneself or others. In terms of self-object theory, stability, continuity, and predictability are essential for a child to develop an accurate sense of causality and thereby learn to categorize experience. Without this, they are unable to understand and integrate information accurately. At an individually psychological and interactively social level, an abused and therefore traumatized child is unable to properly or adequately differentiate and thereby individuate. Lacking safe connections with others, the child is unable to lead a life of meaning and fulfillment. From a developmental standpoint, trauma almost invariably involves not being seen, not being mirrored, and not being taken into account. I want to say something really quick about child development and the idea of mirroring. One of the milestones of a child in their development is being able to mirror you or their caregiver or another child or their sibling. It is so important as a parent that we mirror our child. This can be as basic as the baby's babbling, learning to talk and is babbling, and you sit there and babble back. You're mirroring their behavior, or they reach out to hug you and you hug them back. Things like that. It's so important, and we often overlook that very minor thing, but it is so important. And of course, not being taken into account. We want to include everybody's opinions and feelings when we live in a family unit. When trauma emanates from within the family, children experience a crisis of loyalty and organize their behavior to survive within families. They develop a view of the world that incorporates their betrayal and hurt. They also continually misperceive and therefore misinterpret events in their environment, which causes them to be anxious, frightened, and overreactive. They are haunted by the unceasing expectation of traumatic revisitation and therefore experience it often when it is in fact not there. When a child is repeatedly traumatized, the imprint becomes lodged within the psyche and neurologically reoccurs without external incident. Let me read that again. This is very important. When a child is repeatedly traumatized, the imprint becomes lodged within the psyche and neurologically reoccurs without external incident. So it will reoccur no matter if trauma is actually happening or not continuously. It can even manifest externally from the unconscious as a form of repetition compulsion in an effort to experience and heal what has caused the organism so much harm. Traumatic abuse increases risk factors for addiction and suicidality. It isolates, shames, stigmatizes, and dehumanizes, impacting the individuation process on all fronts and robbing its victims of the self-worth and motivation to continue on productively with their lives. Traumatic events, by definition, thwart initiative and overwhelm individual competence. Traumatized people suffer damage to the basic structures of the self. They lose their trust in themselves, in other people, and in God, or whatever gods, goddess, divine power, etc. The identity formed prior to trauma is irrevocably destroyed, leaving them with no foundational state of homeostasis. Victims of traumatic abuse, therefore, have lost the capacity to relate, adapt, and sustain a basic level of function in human society. They have also lost a coherent sense of self. They are essentially functioning in a partially or completely disassociated state. As chronic abuse causes severe damage on all fronts: psychological, emotional, physical, and spiritual. The physiological changes suffered by chronically traumatized people are often extensive and result in disempowerment, very true, disconnection, and ultimately abject helplessness, powerlessness, and isolation. As a result of abuse, trauma seems to reside not only in our psychology, but also in our very biology. The brain develops relative to its environment and the body follows. This could not be more true. I wish we had more time where I could go on and on about this correlation. According to trauma expert and somatic experiencing founder Peter Levine, he's amazing. If you're interested in psychology, especially around trauma being in the body and in children, he is a phenomenal theorist, author. Trauma is the most avoided, ignored, denied, misunderstood, and undertreated cause of human suffering. Amen. So true. Levine claimed trauma is something that happens initially to our bodies and our instincts. Only then do its effects spread to our minds, emotion, and spirits. So he's saying that we first experience trauma on a physical level, then our mind, emotions, and spirits. Trauma disconnects people somatically from their physical sense of self, robbing them of their inherent bodily sense. Protective and self-sustaining instinctual responses are overwhelmed, leading to numbness, fragility, dysfunction, and collapse of the system. Essentially, each of us has had a traumatic experience at some time in our lives, which demonstrates that trauma is a pervasive fact of modern life. Although the full impact of these experiences may not be entirely conscious, it is nonetheless active. I do want to take a moment to address this. I agree that pretty much each of us has had some level of a traumatic experience at some point in our lives. Nobody, even if you have the quote unquote perfect family, you have money, you have everything you need, all your privilege, you're still going to have had a traumatic experience. Now, you might only have one, you might have multiple, something like a divorce of parents, even if it was amicable, that is a trauma. So that can also trigger very similar feelings, maybe not as intense as someone who's experienced a different trauma. But remember that we often overlook these things that happen to us. And in our society, we don't use this feeling language to identify these really scary and upsetting things that happen to us. And yet we trap it in our body and we continue to try to live our life holding on to it. Now, this article is talking about children in particular, but what I just said is kind of in a general statement, whether you're an adult or not. If we experience a traumatic event, we are going to hold on to it for quite a while, and it takes processing through it in various ways, whatever works for you, to sort of release some of that. And we're going to talk more about recovery in just a second because I don't want you to lose hope here. All right. What then can we learn from this, and how do we adjust to it as clinicians? The clinical relevance of understanding the proverbial precognitive traumatic induction of early childhood is enormous. It can and very likely should inform the entire context of client treatment and methodology, for it already informs the client's own construct in relation to self and others. Agreed. As a clinician, I am trauma focused, so obviously this is, it aligns with my perspective. It is therefore vital that clinicians remain aware of the imminent possibility and likely actuality that symptomatic expression and dysfunction are inherently connected to an area of physical, emotional, and psychological development of which there is no conscious recollection. There is only somatic and behavioral expression, leading in turn to repeated dysfunction and requisite therapeutic mediation. So what he's saying here is that you might come in as an adult to see your therapist and you can't really think about, any specifics. Growing up might have been a little rough. Maybe your father was, really strict and you would get in trouble a lot or something like that. But yet you have chronic stomach aches and you don't really know why. You've gone to the doctor over and over again and there's no medical, according to them, no medical foundation. And through therapy, you might remember, I've had stomach aches ever since I was a child. Oh, really? Well, let's explore that. And then it can come out that, when Dad would get home from work, he would be really on edge. And you remember always feeling a stomach ache because he started to be a little mean to Mom or to another parent. So I could go on with examples. That's just one off the top of my head. All right. Foremost in our understanding, wait, I already read that, sorry. Wait a minute, no, I didn't. Foremost in an understanding as clinicians, therefore, is the recognition that these post-traumatic effects are in no way, in their inception, the responsibility of our clients. Okay? In turn, the obligation entrusted to us is not only to help clients apprehend the origin of these afflictions, but also, above all, to help restore each client's original innocence following the process of victimization. I love that. Of course, clients must undertake responsibility for self-healing. This is, after all, why many clients enter therapy. And yet another vital component of this therapeutic process is to comprehend accurately the causation or origination of traumatic induction, thereby allowing the client to free the repressed emotional content involved and begin to express, process, and cognitively differentiate in a way that is conducive to the client's understanding of what actually transpired. This is the beginning of both healing the trauma that has occurred and ceasing its unconscious perpetuation. Okay. Recovery. What we all need to feel whole is a sense of safety, connection, and presence. This could not be more true. The sense of safety for us as human beings is so important, and it starts so young. And even like, for example, let's say your trauma was the loss of a parent. So for me, the loss of my father, that he made me feel safe. He made our family feel safe. He was, for our family, his presence, I felt safe and contained. I did with my mom too, but it was different with him. He was sort of my pillar and the safe place. When he passed, that sense of safety also shattered. So of course you can imagine some trauma from that loss. Okay, moving on. As part of the individuation process, sensations and emotions are processed only in small increments. This is so true, and this speaks to those of us who start therapy and then we begin to feel like nothing's happening, or all we do is we feel like we're just talking over and over again about the bad stuff and we leave feeling worse. You have to remember that true processing is a process, that it happens in small steps, and if you stick with it and you feel good with your therapist, you absolutely will feel some benefits, but you have got to stick with it and not feel disheartened or give up. However, the brain of a traumatized child has been alerted. It is tuned to high alert and sensitive to the tiniest trigger. In essence, therefore, the present experience is continuously colored by past trauma, which forms a template for their concept of self and their worldview. This imprint actually begins its formation from conception onward and carries enough potency to shape perceptions and beliefs about oneself and the world in which one lives. Let me just quickly say that in utero, a baby, a fetus, etc., begins to their brain begins to develop a concept of self. If you are a pregnant woman and you have endured high trauma, your baby will probably feel some effects of that as well. It's going to be a little bit different than once they were born and if they had specific abuse, but because of your neurobiology that occurs and your levels of cortisol and adrenaline, the stress hormones, it influences the developing fetus. What happens from the fetal period until 2 years of age creates the blueprint that influences every system in the body. Whether a baby perceives the world as friendly or hostile, therefore depends on the quality of these earliest interactions. Since knowing oneself comes through curiosity about what is transpiring within and compassionate self-inquiry into its origin, the individuation process develops and progresses around the fundamental principles of compassionate understanding, integrated awareness, and self-discovery. So you can begin to individuate and heal in the presence of someone who is compassionate, and you being compassionate to yourself, you integrate your new awareness of things you're learning about self, and you continue the journey of self-discovery. Canadian clinician Gabor Mate has spoken in terms of addiction and attachment disorders arising from traumatic induction. Yes. Much of his research has been based on utilizing positive relational approaches to attachment theory to help addicts who have been traumatized in their youth to recover from substance dependency and abuse. Mate contended, addictions always originate in pain, whether felt openly or hidden in the unconscious. They are emotional anesthetics. I think we can agree with that. And a hurt is at the center of all addictive behaviors. Yes. They also have biological, chemical, neurological, psychological, medical, emotional, social, political, economic, and spiritual underpinnings. In fact, emotional isolation, powerlessness, and stress, all symptomatic of early childhood trauma, are exactly the conditions that promote the neurobiology of addiction. And a note on addiction, remember, I'm not just talking about like an obvious addiction like alcohol or pills or coke or meth or crack. We can also be addicted to sex, to porn, to internet, to video games. These are all of those different things. Exactly, they occur and look the same among the brain, whether it's alcohol or video game addiction or porn addiction and meth addiction. Our brain looks the same. Addiction is anathema to the individuation process, rendering it improbable, if not impossible. It damages the part of the brain responsible for decision making and keeps people in destructive relationships. In effect, people who become addicted to their own brain chemicals and are thereby further denied the ability to truly care for the basic life needs the addictions displace. To see addiction as the core problem, however, is to ignore and therefore empower the life event that led to it in the first place. So we may know people who are addicted. We might struggle ourselves and kind of are lost in terms of, yeah, we know, we had a crappy childhood, but we haven't really attached it to our addict behavior. Well, that life event is often going undiscovered or unprocessed, and it manifests through addiction. That's our body's way, our mind's way of trying to find equilibrium. Addiction is a response to life experience, a response that can be only thoroughly alleviated by social support and gentle, consistent inquiry into the origins of self-abusive behavior. Addiction otherwise becomes a reflection and manifestation of the lack of compassion for oneself. The religious or spiritual nature of primary caregiving involves not only the complete absence of purposeful neglect or abuse, but also the mitigation of any harm done inadvertently, as well as the sacrifice and care necessary to refrain from objectifying the organism. Children must be treated as autonomous beings with their own self-expression who are under the ward, protection, and provision of their primary caregivers. Jungian analyst Lionel Corbett connected the psychosocial, emotional, somatic, and interrelational elements of trauma to a person's sense of connection with spiritual reality and expression of soul. Corbett first clarified that the emotional difficulties that result from traumatic abuse can seriously call into question our sense of life's meaning and purpose. For example, as spiritual experience is an emotional experience and emotion is embodied. In a situation of severe illness or chronic pain, people may feel abandoned or betrayed by their God, divine power, goddess, etc., universe. They may feel isolated, helpless, and that life is meaningless. In fact, many abused children have a profound sense of being unchosen. That is true. I have heard it over and over again. Such is their level of self-hatred that they feel as if the universe made a mistake because they were not supposed to be here. As a spiritualized form of introjected psychological assimilation, then, when a child's healthy mirroring or attachment needs are unmet, the result is an emotionally dysfunctional individual with a lifelong need to locate and find meaning in responsive self-objects. As infants, we begin to project our parental images onto our God image. Our God pictures, therefore, invariably become intertwined with our imperfect and often abusive experience of our parents' actions and behaviors towards us, even at the most subtle levels of experience. With this in mind, there can be no higher calling as a parent than to protect an infant's body, care for a child's productive psychosocial development, and provide for a youth's process of self-discovery and unique expression of soul. This is the true cultivation of the individuation process. As clinicians, we have the unique and invaluable opportunity to help remove the obstacles to individual growth and development, and to support the adjustment of familial systems to allow this to take place more gracefully, in spite of the severity of the traumatic induction. Okay, so that was an article talking about all those things, and I'm curious what you think. And I will wrap this up, but I just want to say that there is help. You can recover, and I'm going to list some links below. Just anytime I talk about this mental health stuff, I feel it's so important to provide you with resources to the best of my ability. And if you need any help, just follow those links to learn more. Thank you so much for listening to me, and I really would love to hear what you think about this article. I'll see you later.